That'll be good. All right, so chapter 25 today. The early stuff is a lot of king stuff,
Right.
a lot of authority, ruler kind of stuff. We branched into that yesterday, and this part really kind of continues the theme. We have another restatement that these are the Proverbs of Solomon, and that Judah copied them, or King Hezekiah of Judah had copied them, and these have to do with rulers. For the most part, how to stay on their good side. 6 and 7, don't put yourself forward in the king's presence or stand in the place of the great. It is better to be told, come up here, than to have to be put lower in the presence of a noble. Jesus told a story very much like this. Don't take the places of honor at the banquet, or they'll ask you to move down. Instead of, they'll promote you. Sit at the bottom of the table, the far end, and then you can get to look better instead of look worse. So, interestingly enough, that has been spoken before in the Bible, Michael.
Yeah, I actually had that highlighted, Clint. I think for me, it was less of a connection to other scripture, and for me, it was more of a reflection on the few people in my life I've met who seem to be overly focused on climbing ladders. And there is a kind of person whose attention is devoted towards recognizing the person in a prestigious position or job or with credentials, and sort of seeking that person out. And there is a sense in which that pursuit of people, if you let me use the word ladder, tends to, I think, expose itself pretty quickly as being false, as being shallow and counterfeit. And it in many cases doesn't work out for the person who's investing all their time in that, because it's easy to see through that.
Yeah, I don't know if Mark is with us today, but while I was in Texas, we had a funeral, and the person was in political office at the time, and so lots of politicians came to the funeral, and we had entire debriefs before the service about who needed to sit near the front with the other muckety mucks, and the idea that there needed to be a seating chart kind of reflective of each person's status, and it was really frustrating. And yeah, it's not that kind of scorekeeping. It gives me some. It gives me some comfort in knowing that the Bible's not a fan as well, because I'm not. Verse 9, great. Mm-hmm. Argue your case with your neighbor directly, and do not disclose another's secret. How much conflict could it be avoided if we went to the source of it and didn't talk about it with others? Yep. If you have a problem with someone, deal with them directly and don't talk about it to other people. Ancient wisdom that we are still not following.
Yeah, not only ancient, but it applies to the lessons we try to teach our children. And I'm not saying like adolescent children. I'm saying we were trying to teach our preschool children, if you're not willing to say that to someone, or if you're not willing to say it in front of someone, you shouldn't be saying it. And it's amazing how many of those lessons that should have been lessons that we all internalized in our youth are lessons that we still need to keep revisiting as time goes on. Clint, it is remarkable how powerful, sort of reflecting back on our James Bible study, how powerful the tongue is. The word said out of place, the wrong word said to the wrong person can be incredibly destructive to relationships. And once it's said, it can't be retracted. And we sometimes miss that. Maybe it's the heat of passion. Maybe it's just a moment of anger. But whatever it is, we must practice this, because a lot of the ills of society could be addressed by simply listening to these two verses.
Yeah, and in contrast to 9 and 10, look at verse 11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver, like a gold ring or an ornament of gold is a wise rebuke to a listening ear. The word fitly spoken, that's, all of us ought to endeavor to speak the right words. And again, ancient wisdom that remains difficult to do.
There's sometimes when the Proverbs may not seem like it's dredging the depths of wisdom. It may sound like common sense. This might be one of them. Verse 17, let your foot be seldom in your neighbor's house, otherwise the neighbor will become weary of you and hate you. Not going to belabor this, but there's some wisdom in moderation in relationships. I would say there have been times when we've had conversations, and there are some interactions that you'll have with people who want to come back over and over and over, and it's not the first conversation that can be frustrating, it's the 14th conversation. And it's good to be mindful of other people and have some boundaries and be moderate in your engagement with other people, because it can be frustrating.
Yeah, I mentioned my grandmother before. She was sort of the proverb giver of my childhood. She just said, well, if you were going to someone's house, can I go over there, over to so-and-so's house when you're a kid? She had the same advice. Don't be a nuisance.
Yeah.
So in other words, don't make yourself a pain. Don't overdo it. If you have sort of ever befriended one of those people that doesn't have boundaries, it can be exhausting. Yeah. What else do you have, Michael?
I've got verse 20. Like vinegar on a wound is one who sings songs to a heavy heart, like a moth in clothing or a worm in wood. Sorrow gnaws at the human heart. I think, Clint, I have seen two extremes more often than I thought I would at the beginning of ministry. The one is the person who, in a time of crisis, feels like they have to say something, even if it's an unchecked or unthought through thing. And I think there's another side of that coin that's been surprising, and that is those who say or do absolutely nothing in times of crisis. And I think neither of those are particularly helpful. It's far more helpful to use words when appropriate, but otherwise to just be comfortable being present with someone in need. There really is a sort of pain inflicted on another when you come into a room that makes you anxious. Something bad has happened, and you come into that room and you say something that, quite frankly, doesn't really help. It doesn't help them, it doesn't help you, but it's just words. Sometimes it's better to come in to be that presence and to let that be enough, because that speaks volumes.
Yeah, it's been my experience that when we speak out of a place of discomfort, we almost always unintentionally say something that minimizes a person's pain. Oh, this will get better. Oh, you'll have another baby. Oh, you'll be fine. And we seek to be reassuring, but it really is sort of self-protective, because we don't know how to really respond. And far better, in my experience, is to meet the person where they are and to engage, understand, listen to their pain before we would try to give them some kind of answer or, again, not on purpose necessarily, but to try and minimize that pain. It's just, it doesn't work. If you're in the place where life hurts, those kind of trite answers and sort of flippant comments, they don't bear enough depth to be helpful. So they ring shallow.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mention a few examples of death in particular, because the thing that comes to mind for me is resurrection. I think sometimes we fail to miss the power of the movement of resurrection in human life, because someone dies. We do have the hope of resurrection. Resurrection in Jesus Christ is good news, Clint. But we sometimes too quickly pass over what happens to get us to resurrection. Jesus in the Creed dies and is buried and descends to hell. There's this idea that death is redeemed by God, but it doesn't invalidate the reality of it. So there is grief. There's the reality that Jesus' mother and brothers and family and disciples were all grieving his death in a real and significant way. And so when we are in darkness, there's no reason that we need to be pushed out of it. There can be a moment in which we name the grief and we say that there is grief. Resurrection, though, is a promise connected to it. And so even if you're not ready yet to hear that good news, I feel like there's this balance, even as we seek to pray for those who are grieving, that God will be with them in that season of darkness, and yet they might also have that glimmer of hope that will only grow the hope of resurrection in Jesus Christ. So I guess it's more of a metaphor as I hear it come, but I think there's something in that.
Yeah, I would agree. I've mentioned a couple of times verses in Romans. You see them here verbatim, verses 21 and 22. Paul quotes this. If your enemies are hungry, give them bread, and if they are thirsty, give them water to drink. And, had the Proverbs stopped here, it would have seemed very altruistic, it would have seemed very Christian. Then it continues, though, for you will heap coals of fire on their heads, and the Lord will reward you. The motivation of helping them is not exactly pure here. We've I think, explained enough of the assumptions of Proverbs that we don't have to unpack that again. Proverbs sort of likes the idea that you get what you deserve. And so, the idea here maybe that you make your enemies feel bad by helping them, maybe we'd like to see a purer motive. But the first part of that proverb certainly rings true with what we see Jesus do with it in the New Testament, which is essentially to make it stand on its own and to call us to verse 21 as a way of life, I think irrespective of verse 22, really.
I've got verse 25.
Okay.
Like cold water to a thirsty soul, so is good news from a far country. This is the one I said I was going to twist a little bit. So I want to ask a question to reflect on for just a moment. How many of us feel like we have been inundated with good news recently? I imagine the answer to that question is nearly everyone would say, not me. And what I once heard, this person wasn't religious, they were secular, but they were talking about the impact of digital devices that connect us to the world. As they said that we underestimate the power of being connected to the worst evil in the world every day. And that the human soul is incapable, of bearing up the weight of the incredible amount of suffering that happens each and every day in the entire world. And in the same way that good news from a far country can be cold water to a thirsty soul, I think a regular diet of bad news from a far country can do the exact same. So that even if the bad news isn't related directly to you and your place and your circle and your life and your community, that bad news affects you. It affects you at a very deep and even spiritual level. And I think this is, for me, in this moment in time, in light of all the things happening in the world, Clint, I think it's a reminder that we must audit what we hear, because you can't open the spigot of bad news all the way and that not affect you. I think we need to become responsible sort of arbiters of what we're willing to allow into our consciousness, whether you get that on the TV or the radio or your phone. It doesn't matter how it gets in. I think we should care about whether we hear good news or bad news every day.
Yeah, I'd maybe even go further than that, Michael. I would say that when we give ourselves steady diets of negativity, be it bad news or a certain perspective, when we reinforce that over and over again, it takes our capacity for gratitude. It sours us. We become bitter, we become angry. When we feast on what's wrong with the world consistently, that is inevitably going to impact how we live, how we treat others, how we see others. When we do that, when we, and all of us knows somebody who does it, who spends all their time digging into a narrow band of stuff, and people just don't want to be around them. It does something to us that is not healthy. It is. I suspect maybe we've also all had times when it's just time to shut that stuff off. To just, that's where a season like Lent can be really helpful. Yeah. To just say, I'm just going to back away from it. I'm going to take control back from this thing, whether it's TV or news or internet or whatever, Facebook, Twitter, blah, blah, blah. Fill in the blank. We can make almost anything that thing for ourselves. But that period of withdrawal can be really helpful in those times that we're tempted to think, everything's bad all the time. If that's all you're seeing and hearing, you're going to assume that's true.
Yeah, I'm taking this a little bit farther than maybe is fair, Clint. But I do think there's also some Christian imperative in considering not only what you consume from a far country, but what you are producing and creating out to a far country. And I think I won't be long there, but I do think we have some obligation as Christians to be careful about what we say. And when you pull up that post box on Facebook, if that's the most simple thing, or if you're writing a letter to a friend, even this is relevant, give some time to what you're about to say, because it is so easy to copy and paste things that are not generous, are not good, are not filled with character. They're not humble, right? We have a sense for what we are called to as Christians, but we often fail to take the time to let that reflect in what we produce. And I do think we have some moral imperative to be producers of good. Otherwise, there's some question of how much of the good news have we heard.
Yeah, and I don't know that I would have ever linked these two Proverbs without this conversation, Michael, but I circled the final one, 28 here.
I had that too.
Like a city breached without walls is one who lacks self-control. In other words, when sin or foolishness can overtake our city, and it doesn't even have to climb the gate. It doesn't even have to break in. If we lack self-control, and this is true, name it, sex, alcohol, drugs, gossip, slander, posting things online. Again, you could fill in that blank with a million things that human beings exercise foolishness in. But when we lack self-control, when we lack discipline, when we lack that ability to evaluate, is this a thing that needs to be said or done, then it's like our city, our willpower is overrun, and it's not even difficult. We give into it over and over and over again, and the more we give into it, the easier it is each time.
The thing that I think is so beautiful about verse 28 is how it illustrates the irony of foolishness. The fool is so often focused on the threat outside the walls. And almost without exception, the greatest threat to all of us, this is not just the fool, the wise know this is true of themselves, the greatest threat to all of us is the one within the walls. We are the greatest threat to ourselves if we are unable to exercise self-control, discipline, good character, all of these themes we've seen before. If we cannot do that, it does not matter the magnitude of the enemy outside the walls. We are the weakest link. And I think that's what's so beautiful about this, how often we're worried about protecting the walls, right? Keep it out. But we must first be honest enough to recognize of the weakness that lives inside the walls.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's it. That's chapter 25. Hope there's something in there that might speak to you, might give you something to think about. I think another good chapter. One thing that I appreciate about the Proverbs, Michael, is that in any chapter, you're likely to find something that lands on you in your particular season. And, you could probably just go back and start this book over again. And each and every time you would, I think, find new things that are going to hit you in particular moments. And maybe there's some of that in here today. We'll be in 26 tomorrow. Another pretty interesting chapter. I think lots of good stuff for tomorrow as well. And we hope you can be back with us.
Many blessings. Thanks, everybody. See you tomorrow.
See you guys.
Thank you for spending time with us today as we study Scripture together. If you haven't already, we would invite you to follow us on Facebook or subscribe on YouTube. It's a great way to get notified when these studies happen every day at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. Of course, if you've already done that, we would love for you to be able to give the video a like, to share it if you're on Facebook. This is a great way for other people to find the Bible study and be able to join us in this time studying Scripture. If this is your first time here, welcome. It's such a joy to have you be with us this day, and we would love to get to know you better. We would love if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute to go to our website, fpcspiritlake.org/welcome. We'd love to get your name and email address, and we'll follow up with you personally to thank you for spending time with us this day. And for each and every person that is able to study Scripture and engage in this conversation, we want to say thank you. We look forward to our next time with you every weekday at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time. And until then, God bless.